Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Laurence R. Simon, who is Professor of International Development at Brandeis University, and he directs its Center for International Development and the Sustainable Development Graduate Programs. Laurence, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in New York, in Brooklyn.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
You know, actually, as I've grown older, I've thought a lot about that, particularly because my father was born in the year 1903 on Hester Street, which was really the center of the Jewish ghetto in those years of immigrants who had just arrived, of course, with a major wave of immigration. And the poverty that he grew up in, which I studied many years later as I look back on his life, was profound. And I think looking at that poverty that he grew up in gave me a greater understanding and sensitivity, perhaps, to some of the work that I did later on after I began my career. So, you know, in those years of the early 1900s, the Lower East Side had a child mortality rate of about 150 per 1,000 live births. That's the highest that I think we've ever seen it in developing countries, even in conflict situations. So trying to mine some of my father's experience was very meaningful to me.
Was there a conversation about what he had gone through a lot of the time?
Not at all, and I think it was fairly typical of his generation that there was really no nostalgia. And to him, his upbringing, while he came from a very wonderful family, the neighborhood was not something he ever really referred to. And yet, I became very interested in novels and memoirs of his generation. He was not a person to write such a thing, but and it was very typical of his family, an old world, stern father who would look at his kid who wants to go to school with the Irish and the Italians in public school rather than the Jewish school, and throws his hands up in the air and says, "How did I get this American kid?" But that was the beginning, to me, a lesson within my own family, I think, of kind of a cosmopolitanism, which is the best of America, this cauldron that we grow up in here.
To what extent was that a product also of your Jewish identity?
I'm not sure, because I think many other ethnic groups have gone through a similar transition, of course, when they arrive here. But my father, who was the firstborn in the States of his siblings, he had an older sister who came here as an infant, but he was the firstborn of the family here. Really, I think, represented a kind of tradition back in Russia of a kind of a secular messianic view of the world. He did not come from, his father was religious, but he somehow inculcated the values of a more secular Judaism, but one that really felt very deeply about issues of social justice. I don't think this is unique to Jews, but it is certainly very deeply ingrained, I think, in the values of Judaism.
And your experience in the public schools, how did that shape you?
It was very important to me because I had the privilege of growing up in a community that was very diverse. So sitting next to people of all colors and religions was quite important, I think.
And then where did you do your undergraduate and then graduate work? And what was your graduate work in?
My undergraduate work was at Queens College at the City University of New York, which was a great place, and certainly in the years that I was there, and I studied in philosophy. Philosophy to me represented a discipline that would not limit me. I felt very deeply that I could study ethics as well as aesthetics, and Queens College faculty were very strong in American pragmatism, and all of that very much appealed to me. Then I went on to do graduate work at the New School for Social Research in New York. But those were the years of really the height of the Vietnam War. My draft board very much was eager to send me off to fight, and like many of my generation, I had this profound conflict between going to fight in a war that I absolutely did not believe in, felt it was the wrong direction for our country, or somehow finding a way to stay away from the war. I did so by actually teaching in the South Bronx for the better part of a year until I turned 26, and left the new school actually because I became involved in international development work by first teaching at Fordham University in the Lincoln Center campus and being exposed to so many missionaries, both Latin American missionaries and Americans going back and forth.
Before we talk about your path here, let's stop here a second. What did you get from teaching in the public schools?
First, I think a headache. You know, if you ever needed proof that the schools cannot transform things alone, it was my experience there. This was elementary school, and the kids were bringing really a good deal of violence into the school. The neighborhood was chaotic. Families had very much disintegrated. So the school tried, but in the years that I was there, they really were verging toward almost a draconian kind of school atmosphere that even the principal, when I was there, was beating kids with a ruler, saying that he was African American himself, but feeling that he was the model for them and that they needed this kind of discipline.
But on to graduate school, and
Yes.
where you became a geographer, and where did you do the rest of your graduate work?
Well, I came back to school actually after years of work in development, working with Oxfam in those years, and came back to study geography at the School of Geography at Clark University.
And what did you do your dissertation on?
My dissertation was a comparison of land reform movements in Central America and Zimbabwe, specifically El Salvador, where I had done a good deal of field work, and Zimbabwe, which was very much looking good in those years, of course, with Mr. Mugabe having just come to power.
Before we talk about your really distinguished career in development as a practitioner, as a leader of NGOs, as a researcher, I would like to ask you to sort of, define the role that you've filled, but then also give us a sense of the skills that are involved in this very difficult set of tasks that you've undertaken in working on development, aid, humanitarianism, and so on.
Right. Well, you know, I've seen in the span of my career just a transformation of the field of international development. Almost all of the major relief or development organizations today, Catholic Relief Services and Church World Service and World Vision, all really began as relief organizations. Some of them still have that in their name. And relief was seen as an emergency response to famine, to drought, and so forth. But they quickly, like the Oxfams itself, which originally was the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, in 1942, first operation behind Nazi lines in Greece with Winston Churchill's permission for Oxfam to go in there. They quickly began to recognize that we needed to begin work on the problems that produced famine, that produced the disenfranchisement of so many people that ended up with their entitlements eroding and requiring international assistance. And that's a transformation that to development organizations that I think is a very healthy one.
But now, obviously, more and more young people, especially the idealistic ones, want to pursue this kind of path. And I'm as I look at your story and some of your writings, I get the sense that you really feel that through training and experience, you really have to understand the complexity of the places that you might go to or be part of an organization that's helping.
Absolutely. I often say that in development, context is really everything. There are lessons to be learned from other countries' experience, definitely, but if we don't know the local context, the local institutions and traditions, traditions. For instance, I've done a lot of work on land tenure and land tenure reform. And very often, in the name of modernization, states sweep away the land tenure systems that have really worked well under, say, tribal elders in Africa. And I don't want to romanticize that, but these are systems that actually have served the needs of their communities for many, many years, for hundreds of years, indeed. So I think we shouldn't just sweep things away. We need to understand deeply the cultural roots of civilization in all the places that we work. Our aim is not to just make little Americas of sub-Saharan Africa.
It would seem also that when one actually goes to these places, and some advice you gave yesterday in your lecture to students, it was don't be bothered by having dirt under your fingernails, or you were suggesting that those kinds of people should be employed. And I believe you quoted Larry Brilliant tell us that quote, because you really have to be, I guess, courageous and willing to get your hands dirty if you're going to go to rural provinces and work on aid.
I think so. I mean, the great disadvantage that any of us have, being Americans or Europeans or Japanese or Australians working in aid, is that we are clearly seen as outsiders. And even though we may be welcomed very warmly, we really do not have the experience of having grown up in the deep poverty and despair in some cases that is the life experience of the people that we're going to serve. So, yeah, I've been doing some advising of Silicon Valley philanthropies. And yes, you're right. I mean, one of the bits of advice I give is, please, let's hire people who have dirt under their fingernails. That is, people for whom it's not just an academic exercise or sitting in Washington at major international finance organizations that can do some good work, but really may not be in as close touch again with the grassroots. So Larry Brilliant, the story that you mentioned.
Who is now the head of Google.org.
He's now the head of the Google.org, which includes the Google Foundation. And Larry used to be on a board of directors that I was the president of the American Jewish World Service, and asked Larry to serve on the board. And after a few years, there was a major debate about some of our work that we wanted to do in Eritrea, and particularly with Eritrean refugees. And Larry, I think, at one point threw his hands up and said, look, if you've never been to a refugee camp, you shouldn't be making policy. No, he said, actually, he went further. He says, actually, if you've never had diarrhea in a refugee camp, let's not sit here trying to make policy for refugees. Meaning that boards of directors of many international NGOs are well-meaning, well-intended people, many of whom have never really, again, experienced the life of despair. And it's that level of understanding, I think, that is necessary on boards and for us as practitioners to try to understand why the aid relationships, these so-called partnerships that we try to structure, don't always work out well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have the sense that you believe that one really has to examine one's own philosophical roots, and really that theory and the theory of practitioners is very important for guidance. Now, in your time, you've worked with some extraordinary individuals who could offer that. Paulo Freire in Latin America, and then also with A.T. Ariyaratne.
That's very good.
Yeah. Talk a little about that. What your relationship was with each of these individuals, and what they helped you see.
I was really privileged when I was teaching at Fordham University. I was asked, and I was a very young fellow in those days, I was asked to host the visit of an archbishop from Recife, Brazil, Helder Câmara. And perhaps because I was impressionable, particularly then, or maybe because of the real holiness of this gentleman, that I was tremendously, deeply influenced by his life's work. And he told me a story, and he introduced me subsequently to Paulo Freire, but he told me a story about when he was first appointed Bishop of Recife. And he went out, and he was already a person who saw the poverty of Brazil through a very politicized lens, but he had never worked in the Northeast. He went there and he tried to go out to meet the parishioners all over the Northeast. And he knew that infant and child mortality was among the highest in the world. And he told me that he asked the people one simple question at every village. He says, "Why is it that so many of your children die?" And Dom Helder heard, he told me, the same answer invariably everywhere he went. "But, Monsignor, this is the way God made the world." And the Archbishop, told me that he saw the rest of his life's work unfold before him to try to break people out of that internalization of oppression, that sense of fatalism, of deterministic universe that they existed in, that there was no sense of personal agency, no critical consciousness, as Paulo Freire would call it later, to understand the objective causes of their poverty. And Paulo Freire came up through the northeast of Brazil. He was born there, he was raised there, he became very much involved in Catholic action movements. And he also had a great influence on me as his work began to gain a great prestige, not only in Latin America, but throughout the world.
And what about the Asian influences? I mean, what
Yes.
were you, as you learned from these people who were more directly exposed to
Yes.
to the worlds that we're talking about changing, were you seeing things that you actually hadn't thought of, even though you had grown up in the East Side of New York?
I think the major lesson for me was that development cannot succeed without indigenous leadership, that we cannot lead people to development. We can provide science and competence and training in some respects for more technical things, but that the real issues of poverty are about politics and about the lack of political will to solve problems that are so deeply entrenched in many societies around the world. So whether it is Damhilda Kamra or Dr. Ariyaratne in Sri Lanka, who has led for all these years now one of the largest non-governmental organizations in Asia called the Savrodya Movement, these are the kinds of leaders, I think, whether they are charismatic leaders or building of solid NGOs like Abed, who founded and heads the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, or Yunus and Grameen. These are the people, I think, who have the vision, the understanding of their local cultures, and the changes that need to occur within culture in order to bring people into the modern world and into the eradication of poverty.
How, I know that one of your first positions in this work,
Yes.
if not the first, was as head of Oxfam USA, and then later head of global research for Oxfam.
Yes, at Oxfam, I was at first I worked helped to open up the Central America projects, and also began our educational work here in the United States, which led to the recognition that we wanted as an organization to try to influence the United States policy vis-a-vis developing nations because of the profound impact that the U.S., of course, had and still has on the world of development.
And as you did that work, especially in Central America,
Yes.
you really came to a realization, as I understand it, of the structural problems
Absolutely.
within these countries. For example, land reform,
Yes.
that really had to be addressed.
Latin America is still very much characterized by its landlessness. That is, among the poor. Overwhelmingly, I mean, it's easier to see an apartheid society like South Africa was, or Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe was, because the divide between white and black was obvious to everybody who would look at it, and the injustice of that situation was quite apparent to, I think, the world community. But what we see in Latin America, we see in the island of Negros in the Philippines, we see in rural Pakistan today, is really a feudal structure still, where people who are poor today were farmers. They consider themselves in Latin America still campesinos, which means small farmer, but they have no land or they don't have secure access on their land. And in the absence of alternative opportunities for household income, the families are hungry, perpetually hungry. So you have a tremendously skewed ownership of land in many of these societies, which is grossly immoral, I think, and unjust.
Yesterday in your lecture, you said something interesting. You said that a key indicator, the way that we should look at these places, was the survival of the child.
Survival of children, indeed. I think that the world of development is very complex, and sometimes I think we get lost in it. There's so much to do. I think that a lot of our aid, whether it's from international NGOs, particularly from the United States government, I would hope, and hope in this new administration, would focus on people who are one step above famine. That is, people who are so poor and so disenfranchised that they cannot guarantee the survival of their own children against not just famine, but against diseases that we know how to cure, that are entirely preventable. I think that's the major contribution we have to make for a number of reasons. First of all, it addresses the real half the world's population that continue to live on the equivalent of $2 a day. As I like to remind people that the statistic is $2 a day as if they lived in the United States, not $2 a day in Bangladesh, the buying power of $2 a day here. That's pretty poor. Mm-hmm. So I think, though, that's really the population that we need to focus on. The other reason is that child survival, we have realized, is the key, or certainly one of the major keys to stabilization of population. That there's no society on earth that I know of that has been able to reduce its fertility rates the way the industrialized nations have without first guaranteeing child survival. That is, I think, still paramount.
In your work at Oxfam, it's very clear that it was a real learning curve for you. You were seeing things that you hadn't realized. Yes. And one of your insights over time was the idealism and the well-intentioned motivation of, for example, in the context of a famine, of providing immediate aid, had unintended consequences that led you to actually question that initial action from those very idealistic purposes.
Well, I think we see in every major disaster. We need only look back a few years now to the terrible tsunami that hit Indonesia. 3 hours later hit Sri Lanka, and tens of thousands of people perished, and even hit the coast of Africa. To realize that that disaster response or emergency response, relief, is still done in a very chaotic manner. We've learned a lot as professional organizations, but in the midst of a major catastrophe like that, every organization tries to arrive there, comes with its own presumptions about what the needs are. So to give you, I think, a stunning example, Sri Lanka, after a few days, began to turn away flights of surgeons and medical personnel from other countries. And Israel had a plane load of physicians coming in, turned away, and immediately the press began to suspect that, this is politics interfering with the relief work. In fact, it's because Sri Lanka has been in the foreground for many decades of public health work. The tsunami didn't affect any of the hospitals. The entire medical establishment and public health establishment of Sri Lanka was intact. And they didn't need the assistance, and the airport was completely clogged with unnecessary supplies, thousands of aid workers flooding in that weren't entirely needed, or in some cases not needed at all. So I think chaos really reigns in these relief operations. And
the chaos, in a way, is I think you're suggesting on the West, or the benefactor side, in the sense that our idealism is not giving us the wherewithal to look at what the actual situation is. You talk in one of your articles about the Guatemala earthquake, the immediate sending of food, and that aid was screwing up a nascent market. Tell us about that, because that's really quite extraordinary.
That was actually one of the great lessons of that era. This was in the aftermath of a major earthquake in Guatemala, late 1970s. And the assumptions, of course, on the aid establishment in the United States and other countries too, was that in the aftermath of a major disaster of any kind, you bring in food. We knew, being on the ground in Guatemala in those days with Oxfam America and Oxfam Great Britain and others, that earthquakes don't normally destroy food stocks. They may shake things up, but the field crops usually survive unless a dam bursts and floods a valley or something, which didn't happen. And the effect of bringing in massive quantities of American food aid actually knocked the bottom out of the market for all of the small farmers in the highlands, particularly, whose crops were just coming to market. So it depressed prices. So it actually worked against relief, because people's livelihoods were damaged, not by the earthquake itself, but by the relief program. And we at Oxfam actually had to institute a price stabilization. We began to soak up the excess commodities on the market, the locally produced food, until such time that we could convince the United States to please suspend your food aid programs and let the markets recover.
Now, in your work at Oxfam, you were involved and wrote some of the first audits where you were actually trying to say, well, this is what's going on, you know, this was what our programs were, and let's really evaluate them. And in the course of doing, and the purpose here, as I understand it, was for public education, for self-analysis within the organization, but you discovered something else, and that was the perspective that American power often had different goals, and I guess this was quite a learning experience for you, and it's kind of very important. So it's not just the idealism, which can go awry, as you've already suggested, but also that powerful interests may have different agendas, including the American state.
Yeah. If I were making any recommendations to the new Obama administration, it would be, and I think I speak on behalf of many international development organizations here too, to try to buffer the American aid establishment, our United States Agency for International Development and other such groups that provide aid in the name of America, to try to buffer it from the State Department, particularly from national security interests. Not that the national security interests aren't often very legitimate and important objectives of United States foreign policy, but they may in fact run counter to the objectives that I tried to lay out a few moments ago of working with the poorest of the poor, of helping people to overcome some of the structural injustices within their society. And my experience is that whenever we are working in countries where the U.S. sees a national security threat, the United States Agency for International Development becomes a handmaiden of national security interests and really distorts our aid objectives. And that's not, and I think it works against the interests of the poor.
And during the period that we're talking about, it was really anti-communism and alliances with military and feudal interests, basically. Yes. And I guess you were really discovering that even within Oxfam, the worldwide organization, that there was a resistance to going public with regard to some of what you were seeing, until they came to realize that Oxfam workers in Central America were actually being killed by the military. So you can't run away from power.
You really can't. But it is complex, because when we were about to release one of our audits on the rural violence in Guatemala, this was at a time that the United States was considering reinstatement of military aid to then a military dictatorship in Guatemala, ostensibly to stop a communist revolution, but it was not seeing the reality on the ground of what was fueling the historic rebellions of Central America at all. We sent our draft, of course, to the other Oxfams for review because we shared a name, and that's very important that we not jeopardize anybody who's working in the field under the name of Oxfam. And the head of Oxfam Great Britain did call and ask us not to release the report because he felt that, not so much because Brits working there or Americans working there might be endangered, because the hundreds of nationals, Guatemalans, that were working on Oxfam projects might be endangered if the name Oxfam became very politicized in the minds of the death squads and the military dictatorship. We held off on that. And then about 6 months later, Brian Walker, the head of Oxfam Great Britain, called up again and said, release your report and please help us organize a lobbying campaign in Washington against U.S. policy in Guatemala now, because they could document, they said, and we're about to release this report, over 400 deaths of Oxfam workers. Now, not the Americans like myself, but Guatemalans who were terracing hillsides, who were working on primary health care, who were being targeted by death squads because they saw development, any kind of community development, as, in their eyes, the vanguard of a revolution. So it's a complex equation also. There are organizations that work in relief like Médecins Sans Frontières, the Doctors Without Borders, who they don't put up with grief. They will say to a government that if you're not permitting us to get our work done, they will pick up and leave. And others recognize that if they're working in relief and even in development, there are times you want to keep a low profile and just try to get as much done as is humanly possible.
In this early era, your work in Central America and then in Cambodia, the boogeyman of national security was communism in the Soviet Union. And when you write about your work in Southeast Asia, aid programs were running up against the wall of the anti-Vietnamese sentiment of the U.S. government. Well, we've moved past that era in a way, but now I think we've moved into an era where the goal of U.S. foreign policy is alleged to be democratization on the one hand, but we see military power as the vehicle for implementing democratization. And I guess in this recent period, our elites seem to have learned that you can't democratize unless you have security, and that democratization is much more complex. And at a certain point, we're going to be talking about development. But now we're in a situation where we're doing a lot of this through the military. Talk a little about that.
Absolutely. Well over 20% of the United States economic assistance, our ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, now goes through the Department of Defense. I hope that's going to be reversed in the new administration. This question of democratization is really a troubling one, but also within USAID, I think it's troubling. I interview a fair number of USAID mission directors as I work around the world, and I very rarely meet anybody who can explain to me what it actually means on the ground. What do they do? Sometimes they're working in developing a free press. Fine, that's a good thing to do. I think whether we can really do that is, I think, questionable. But a lot of our aid goes now to the private sector because we believe in private sector solutions. Again, if private sector can emerge as it is in China, as it has stunningly in India and opened itself to the world, that's great. Investment's going to flow there. They don't need USAID's funds. They don't need my contributions as a private citizen to help private sectors, I think, emerge, around the world. I was very close to the governor of the Bank of Uganda, the Central Bank of Uganda, Governor Chikanyoko. And he once told me, he passed away a few years ago, but he once told me at a time when Uganda was being portrayed as kind of the poster child, if you will, of structural adjustment, of doing all the right things to open their economy globally, to allow in foreign investment, to have an enabling environment for development. And he told me that, yes, he said, Larry, we're making a lot of progress. We are being praised, but I'm becoming very fearful, were his exact words to me, fearful, that it's proving easier to develop an elite economy linked globally than it is to incorporate the great masses, the great majority of Ugandans who are dirt poor into that elite economy. And those words have really rung true to me. It's not that India, with all of its tremendous assets and skills, cannot possibly address the structural inequalities within their country, but they have hundreds of millions of people who are living like in the 15th century, and then half of their country that are really first world citizens today. That's the great challenge, I think, for them, to incorporate the masses of the poor, to break down their social isolation, even their psychological isolation, to be able to be prepared to enter the modern world.
Now, in your work after Oxfam, you were the first president and creator
Yes.
of the American Jewish World Service.
Yes.
And I want you to tell us what that was. And it was during that period that you were an innovator in the sense of working with Israeli scientists to create storage bin
Yes.
for post-conflict and famine situations. Tell us about that. I'm very interested in the dynamic of what NGOs can do, and how you can reach out to create something that sort of wouldn't happen. So it's a kind of leadership that actually is respectful of your overall paradigm.
Yes. Well, first I left Oxfam in late 1984 and founded the American Jewish World Service in my living room in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Spent about 6 months trying to convince the first person to join the board. Eventually succeeded in getting wonderful people, the rabbinical leadership of the United States, and wonderful people like Elie Wiesel and others to join and to back this movement. And I saw it as an attempt to become kind of a Jewish Oxfam, if you will. That is a highly professional organization working in a completely nonpartisan way with the poor of the world, and also use it as a vehicle for the American Jewish community, both the large numbers of unaffiliated Jews, as well as synagogues and temples, Jewish temples all over the United States, to learn something more about development. We did a lot in Oxfam on development education with our own constituency. I wanted to be able to do that with the Jewish community. Our board, of course, was very encouraging of my involving Israeli institutions in that effort. Of course, a lot of what I found in Israel was very high-tech, incredibly creative solutions to their own problems, but not things that you could bring to a field without electricity and to the standard living of many African farmers or others. But I did find a couple of wonderful researchers at the Volcani Center, the Agricultural Research Center in Israel. Dr. Shlomo Navarro, who grew up in Turkey, and Jonathan Donehey, who was French but grew up during World War II in England, who had created the world's really first very successful airtight or hermetic storage of grains. And Israel was storing in large hermetic stores with no fumigation, absolutely zero chemicals, and storing indefinitely with zero losses. So I latched onto that and I said, wow. And I raised foundation money to be able to bring them. They traveled with me throughout the world. And I said, I want you to take a look at what the problems of storage are in international relief organizations, where we often lost 40 to 50 or more % of incoming commodities from rot and insects and rodents on the docks in Djibouti and other places that we overwhelmed immediately with the first supplies. And also take a look at the lives of small farmers and their post-harvest losses, their storage losses, and see whether we could adapt this, which they did very successfully. I think that was the proudest accomplishment, frankly, one of the things that I'm most proud of in my own career, and I think American Jewish World Service should be very proud of its accomplishment in that area.
So it's interesting because on the one hand, the West creates technologies that they see, that we see as a magical cure.
Yes, indeed.
Increased bandwidth. Every student in the poorest village will have a computer with an internet connection. But so that's one side. And again, it's all very well intentioned. It's American idealism and American wealth. But on the other hand, you're suggesting that what your career has taught you is that you have to understand the culture, the situation, respect the leadership that's on the ground, and that in fact there are openings for innovation, but it might be something as mundane as a storage facility for grain or a sanitation facility for Sarajevo.
No, I think that's right. I mean, technical innovation certainly has an enormous contribution to be made in development. We need to bring science and technology to the people. I'm delighted that Google and other great corporations are trying to bring increased bandwidth to sub-Saharan Africa. That's all for the good. I'm happy that Google went into China. It was somewhat controversial, not the foundation, but the corporation itself, because they, of course, had to agree to permit the Chinese government to censor the web. We saw some of that during the Olympic Games with the press complaining about that. But I think it is for the good, because every new access to the world, to the extraordinary information that you and I have at our fingertips today, I think increases this sense that we are all, in fact, in one global society today. So innovation is sometimes difficult to bring to, particularly in very poor areas where people are risk averse. You know, we have tickets in our back pocket to go home if we get sick. If the innovation fails, we don't suffer the consequences as the farmers' children might. But I think that innovation is certainly an important component of development.
Your work has touched on the problem of religion. I mean, in Latin America, it was the liberation theology that really exposed the conditions of the people on the one hand. On the other hand, in some of these places, religion, in a way, can be a helpmate, or it can be an adversary in lifting up the poor. Talk about that. And again, I should mention that we see that in the face of certain natural disasters, that it's often the religious groups in the West that are best mobilized to actually provide it. Share with us your reflections on the pluses and minuses of religion as we address issues of world poverty.
Remembering that I began my earliest experience in Latin America, and with missionaries, not only from America, but Latin American missionaries, Spanish missionaries. And these were people who impressed me. And here I was a young Jewish guy coming into Latin America without much of an appreciation of the role of the Catholic Church, maybe knowing historically that the Church had come in with the conquistadors and had for centuries really were very close to the oligarchies that were repressing and disenfranchising so many of their citizens. But I experienced a Latin American church in the aftermath of the Medellin Conference of Bishops that chose what they called the option for the poor. That said that we have to break from this alignment that we have historically had with the very wealthy in Latin America. We needed now to address the fundamental problems of injustice that is fueling the famines, the perpetual hunger, the deep and deepening poverty that they saw in all of their countries of Latin America. So I was really privileged to be part of that as an observer, but be part of that to begin to appreciate what it meant for thousands of base Christian communities to pop up all over Latin America, with lay leaders studying the social gospel, earmarking certain pages for future reflection. When Jesus talked about, the passage such as when Jesus turns to his disciples and says that I will divide you on my left and my right, and he turns to one side and he says, when I was hungry you did not feed me, and when I was thirsty you did not give me drink, and when I was in prison you did not visit me. And they say, but Lord, when were you hungry and we didn't feed you? When were you thirsty, etc.? And he says, insofar as you have not done this unto the least of these, my brethren, that is the child, the starving child, ye have not done this unto me. That's a powerful lesson for the people of Latin America about justice. And these are people who, throughout Latin America, like the people that Paulo Freire began working with in the northeast of Brazil, who lived in a psychological isolation, lived in an almost semi-feudal relationship to power structures within their own society. And for them to begin to reflect on the importance of the Bible to teach them lessons about justice in society, about interpersonal relationships that the rich need to have to get beyond their own concepts of power and justice and power and generosity, to get to issues of realignment of society, to give all citizens of the world a decent chance at a life. This was a very powerful lesson for me.
Now, what is, you quoted a bishop. Tell us that quote that you used yesterday about the bishop who said, I gave food to the poor. Yeah.
That was Helder Câmara again of Recife in Brazil, who during the days of military repression in Brazil, used to say that when I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. But when I ask why are they hungry, they call me a communist. Now, in some respects, that era is gone, we know, of course. Mm-hmm. But still, the structures of society are still largely in place. Today, the change, of course, is that in Brazil, we have a very large and powerful landless workers movement. And we have a president in Brazil, Lula, who is very sympathetic, who came out of that very same kind of social movement, who understands the life of the people. So we have seen in some respects a sea change in many Latin American countries to a government that wants to create an enabling environment for development. But still, it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to change those structures. I think it's difficult in the United States also. We're in the midst of a massive economic crisis. What really are the prescriptions for reining in Wall Street's worst instincts? These are very difficult things to do beyond maybe some modest regulatory regulations that will come through the new administration.
And what is the difference here? Because what your experiences from that Cold War period
yes.
are actually very relevant today,
yes.
and you believe that there should be more aid. You believe that people from the outside should be working through social movements, but we still run up against the interests of the powerful,
yes.
both there
yes.
and here. And here it could very be paying homage to the goddess market, basically, who's not doing too well right now as a goddess. But I guess what I'm curious about, and I think our audience would be interesting, is what is it that makes the difference? You're arguing there has to be insight
yes.
beyond the conventional wisdom, and it's by listening to the people there, working with their leaders. But we still have to work against the power structures there and the
right.
power structures here.
Right.
Please.
I think one of the paths out of this is, in fact, to recognize that cultural and spiritual movements that we find almost everywhere in the developing world have, I think, some of the answers for us. So, in contrast to Latin America, where the work of Paulo Freire and others became kind of a confrontational model, as we could see, in many places in Asia, coming out of their own culture, particularly Buddhism in Sri Lanka, where I worked extensively, and in other places, they see it as a function of enlightenment. They talk like the Savrodya movement of Sri Lanka, headed by Dr. Ariyaratne. They talk about the importance of personal awakening, kind of like a lotus blossom unfolding. The personal awakening to one's own responsibility to oneself, family, to village, to country, and indeed to the globe, and indeed to all species of life on Earth. So it's a beautiful vision of release, of liberation in a sense, but one that begins from deep within oneself. Now that applies, they feel, just as strongly, just as much to the large landowner who became part of Gandhian movements in India and gave up their lands, as it does to just a very poor person. And I think that's one of the visions also of Freire, that the poor need to develop their own leadership. But we, who have influence over the rich and over the powerful, we need to work in our own communities to allow that leadership to be nurtured, allow that leadership to develop, and not to block the kind of change. That's hard because we see it often as threatening to ourselves.
If you were in a world where the insights that you have gathered over the years could be on the desk of President-elect Obama, what would, I mean, obviously we're dealing with complexities here that no one president could deal with, but but there must be one or two big ideas that we in the United States have not learned, or at least our presidents have not learned. Even when we've had Democrats, even when our Democratic presidents have worshipped globalization. What would you like to see as a change, an idea that gets to President-elect and President Obama's desk?
Right. Well, I think the first one is not specifically about foreign aid, but about globalization. That globalization, as it's seen by peoples, particularly in poor countries, particularly the poorer segments of society, see it as a homogenization, as almost a cultural imperialism. They have witnessed over the years kind of the eroding of their own cultures and the Americanization of their cultures. Now, some of that is very good. I mean, human rights have spread around the world. Gender rights have spread around the world, not just from America, but even from within their own cultures. And if that's part of globalization, then I'm all for that, absolutely. A spirit of justice and being cosmopolitans in the world is also part of globalization. But I think one of the lessons that we have learned, and that I would hope Mr. Obama and others would think about, and I think actually he does, is that the kind of globalized society that we should be striving for cannot just look like America. America should look like America. But even in the most radical fundamentalist movements, religious movements that we feel very threatened by, and should, because they are intolerant and they are violent, I have seen a cry to build a society that is true to its own ancient values. I'm not frightened of an Islamic organization that wants to build a Sharia society. You can interpret that very narrowly and intolerant and against other Muslim sects, or you can interpret it, as many Muslims do, as a very tolerant system of justice that is not inconsistent with the kind of Christian values and Jewish values and the best of Hinduism and other major religions, Judaism, that we have seen. We can't go to a globalization that is only seen as commercialization, as capitalism run amok in societies that don't have the regulatory environment that we do. We need to genuinely go, I think, to a globalization where we see the rise of culture that's going to influence us just as profoundly as we will influence them.
One final question. If students were to watch this program, what should they do about preparing for their future, do you think?
Travel. I think I would love to see the abolishment of high school. I think the most profound experience that any young person, whether American or Bolivian or Bangladeshi, can experience, in fact, is to get out of their own familiar setting and experience something of the life of the world. And that doesn't mean that they have to go to very poor communities in Bangladesh if they're American. Go to France. Go to Australia, but also go to developing nations. I have seen in my own life and life of my children and many of my own students how profoundly changed they are. They really come back world citizens, recognizing that what we have cherished here in the United States is a wonderful society that has prospered and is built on fundamental freedoms that we do cherish. But there are other societies that also have freedoms that are deeply entrenched in their own cultures that we need to respect. They may articulate them differently, but that one-to-one relationships that they build when people travel, I think is a profound, should be a profound influence on our youth.
Larry, on that note, I want to thank you for coming to Berkeley and sharing your experiences in the world of development and humanitarianism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.